bad with getting off on Thursday afternoon as it used to be the Sunday morning after camp meeting, because you go till about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, cleaning up and getting done on Friday night, Saturday morning, and then Miss Jimmy'd want everyone there at 6 o'clock in the morning to wash sheets Saturday morning. And that first Sunday morning, you come in dragging. You come in dragging. And then the kids are like, are we going to have to get there early? Because back in the day, we'd take the whole sound system from here and take it over to the camp and set it up. And then I'd have to come in on Sunday morning. That was back before I was teaching. And all Sunday morning during Sunday school, I'm trying to put all the cables back in the right place and getting all the computer stuff put back where it's supposed to be. And thankfully this time I had the camera and one lapel was all I had to hook back up this morning. So it's just it's gotten progressively better what we're doing. And so hopefully by next camp meeting we have a camera. I don't even have to pull the camera down anymore. And we probably could have got away without bringing the lapel over, but Brother Randy likes to wear a lapel all the time, and then we have one extra lapel for a preacher, so we may end up buying another one of those, and then we'll really be good. But anyway, like I said, it is good. You're not dragging as much this morning as the old days. But hopefully everyone enjoyed their Thanksgiving, and I thought about it during Thanksgiving. I thought, again, we're busy. It's camp meeting. You're going to church, and then you're having your dinner and everything. But I hope you took the time to really stop and think about, just count your blessings. Just count your blessings to what God has done for you. It's in the word Thanksgiving, but I wonder how many people actually stop and really even think about it. It drives me crazy when people call it Turkey Day. It's one of my pet peeves. It drives me crazy, but a lot of people don't even look at it as Thanksgiving. They just, it's just a couple days off of work or something, and they just, they don't even stop and count their blessings for what God has done for them. But anyway, we'll get back into the Sunday school lesson now. 2 Kings chapter number 20. 2 Kings chapter number 20. And we will begin reading in verse number 1. And I will tell you that I will not argue with you either way when it comes to this passage right here. If you tell me that you think this happened, if this happened while Sennacherib was besieging Jerusalem, I'll not argue with you. Or if you think it happened afterward, which is more how I lean. But like I said, I will not argue with you either way. In verse number 20, it says, "In those days was Hezekiah sick unto death. And the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amoz, came to him and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. Then he turned his face to the wall and prayed unto the Lord, saying, I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. And it came to pass, afore Isaiah was gone out into the middle court, that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Turn again, and tell Hezekiah, the captain of my people, Thus saith the Lord, the God of David thy father, I have heard thy prayer, I have seen thy tears. Behold, I will heal thee. On the third day thou shalt go up unto the house of the Lord. And I will add unto thy days 15 years, and I will deliver thee and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. And Isaiah said, Take a lump of figs, and they took and laid it on the boil, and he recovered. And Hezekiah said unto Isaiah, What shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me, and that I shall go up into the house of the Lord the third day? And Isaiah said, This sign shalt thou have of the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing that he hath spoken. Shall the shadow go forward 10 degrees, or go back 10 degrees? And Hezekiah answered, It is a light thing for the shadow to go down 10 degrees, nay, but let the shadow return back 10 degrees. And Isaiah the prophet cried unto the Lord, and he brought the shadow 10 degrees backward, by which it had gone down in the dial of Ahaz. So again, if you look in chapter number 18, which you don't have to turn there, but in chapter number 18, it says that in verse number 13, now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah. And then let me flip back and find it right here. I didn't write it down where it was, but in the Hezekiah was 25 years old. He was 25 years old whenever he began to reign. I didn't write it down exactly where it was. But anyway, he was 25 years old when he began to reign. And you see here in 2 Kings chapter number 18 that it was 14 years, and so he would have been 39. And so he died at 54. He died at 54 years. And so that's why I said I wouldn't argue with you either way, because it's all in that 14th year. It's all in that 14th year right there that this happened to him between when Sennacherib came up and besieged Judah, and whenever this is occurring right here, because we know he lives 15 years from when Isaiah tells him, this is when you're going to pass away. So again, in this passage right here, and think about it, and again, like I said, you can think about it either way. Whether he was in the midst of this struggle with Sennacherib, and how that Sennacherib looked like he was going to take over his kingdom, or if you look at it as, hey, he's just come out of this victory, he's about to breathe a sigh of relief, he's like, whew, finally, I made it out, and as soon as he makes it out, God allows him to come down with a boil, God allows him to come down with his disease, and it says he was sick unto death. It's one thing, it's one thing to be sick. It's one thing to not feel good, but it's a whole nother thing when you realize, I think I'm going to die. I think I'm going to die. And unfortunately, it's been a reality from 2020 on. It's just, something we've dealt with where people realize, there comes this point where it's like, hey, I've gone beyond. I thought I was going to get better. I felt like I was doing pretty good. Next thing you know, they're like, hey, you need to call the family in. You need to let the family know. And so it's just something we've dealt with in the last couple years. And so, but the Bible says he was sick unto death. So he realized, hey, I'm pretty sick right here. And again, you think he's the king, so he's had the doctors in already, and they're trying to figure out what to do, and they're trying to treat it, and they're trying to do everything they can do, but he's not being healed. And so no doubt he was praying, he was praying before Isaiah ever came. He was praying to God, but it's funny, the urgency of your prayers change sometimes. Sometimes you're just like cruising along, and I had a teacher in where I work, but he would teach classes, and he said you're strolling along, fat, dumb, and happy, and you're just strolling along like that, and you're praying, but you're not really earnestly praying. You're not really that serious until you realize, hey, wait a second here, this is serious. I could die right here. And so Isaiah comes to him, and I want us to think about this, because several things happen in this chapter. Number one, Isaiah comes with a message. He walks away, and then when he comes back, he's coming back with a different message. Now I'm going to tell you, I believe that there are a lot of preachers that they couldn't do that right there. Because it's going to make them, they'd feel like it was going to make them look bad. They'd feel like, I just gave him the message, and now I'm going to turn around, and now it makes it look like I didn't know what I was talking about. And so you think about Isaiah, he gives the man a message, and he walks out, and he's only to the middle court, and God says, hey, turn around and go back and tell him something different. And you think about it. Brother Mike quotes, Brother Mike quotes the verse all the time when he prays, that I'm the Lord, I change not. Therefore, you sons of Jacob are not consumed. I mean, you think, God changed his mind in a matter of minutes. God changed his mind in a matter of minutes. And you're like, well, maybe God didn't change his mind. Again, we understand that God knew all along what was going to happen. God knew all along what was going to happen. Maybe God didn't change his mind. Maybe he was just using this to test Hezekiah's faith. Maybe he was just using this to test Hezekiah's faith. I don't know. You can make your mind up on your own on that one right there. But you understand that here comes Isaiah, and it wasn't just anybody. Again, this was Isaiah, and again, in the previous chapter, who did Hezekiah go to? Who did Hezekiah go to? He didn't go to the chief priest. He didn't go to those, but he went to Isaiah. He went to Isaiah in the previous chapter when he was having all those problems with Sennacherib. And so now here is Isaiah coming back. And Isaiah comes back and says, hey, you need to set your house in order. But he tells him, he said, thus saith the Lord. And so again, you walk up to a man who feels like, no doubt, he feels like he's on his deathbed. And he's laying there, and here comes the prophet, and I'm sure that Hezekiah was hoping it was good news. You think about, here's my chance, and I've been laying here, and I've been praying, and here comes Isaiah, and I don't know how it went, but you can imagine, you just didn't get an automatic audience with the king. You just didn't get an automatic audience, and someone had to come tell Hezekiah, hey, someone wants to see you. I feel so bad, I don't want to see anybody. Who is it? It's Isaiah. Okay, let him come in. I'll talk to Isaiah. And I'm sure he was hoping that it was good news, Brother Croft. I'm sure he was like, hey, Isaiah is going to bring a word from the Lord. It's going to be good, and he's going to tell me that I'm going to get better. And that's not what he does. And again, like I said, I don't want to make it sound like we're Catholic, but sometimes we do. We're like, well, I got more on the good side of the scale than on the bad side of the scale, so God should do something good for me. And that's basically what he's going to pray here in a few moments. But you understand? That's not how God works. And that's not how we should look at it. But here's Hezekiah, and he's like, "Hey, look, I've done this, and I've done this, and I've tried to do this, and I'm sure he wanted to say I'm not like my father, and I did, I tried to bring Judah and Israel back to God, and I tried to do all these things. But here Isaiah comes, and he said, "Hey, thus says the Lord, set thine house in order." What? Set my house in order? What do I need to set my house in order for? I'll be up in a few days once you tell me that God's going to heal me. And he said, set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. That's a pretty tough, you think, there's no one in here 39 years old. Me and Brad are probably, actually my wife right there. My wife is probably the closest. She's only a year removed from 39, year and a half removed from 39. But and my daughter's up there. She's not close. She's a lot younger. But at 39, that's too young. Even in this day, you think about it. I hear some people dying in their mid 60s, and I'm like, that's too young. That's just too young. It's too young. With the modern medicine that we have nowadays, and the fact that that we understand diseases so much better than we did so long ago. It's too young. 39 though. 39. Again, like I said, I'm in my mid 40s now, and I'm like, hey, look, I want to see my kids get married. One of these days, I want to have a grandkid. I want to know this stuff. I want to have my house paid off. I want to know what it's like to be, completely debt free. I want all this stuff. And so at 39, it's like, hey, that's too young. And no doubt Hezekiah, when he was told that was not the word he was expecting from God. That was not the word. But how do you deal how do you deal with it when you get a word that's not the word that you were wanting from God? How do you deal with it? It's tough. Again, it's tough when you pray and pray and pray, and you have faith, and you're like, God, and you really hammer down on God, and God's like, not gonna do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to change it. And you're like, but God, you told me to pray and trust you and believe, and I'm trying to do all those things, and I'm not trying to consume it upon my lust. I'm trying to do everything right. And God says, no. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that? Because it's tough. And you think, Hezekiah did not accept no. He turned his face to the wall. What did God tell him to do? God told him to set his house in order. He didn't set his house in order. That's not what he did. He did not set his house excuse me. When Isaiah left, he didn't call him in and say, hey, look, I need you to call my wife in, or wives if he had multiple wives. I need you to call some of the princes in. I need you to call some of these people in because I'm going to die. That's not what he did. That's not what he did at all. He didn't call the lawyer and say, look, I'm going to write out my last will and testament, and I want my wife to get this, and I want this. He didn't do that. If a man of God came to you when you were sick on your deathbed and said, hey, you're going to die, you need to set your house in order, what would you do? And so he said no. He said, no, I respect what Isaiah said. I respect what Isaiah said, but I got to talk to God for myself here. I have to talk to God for myself here. I have to hear it directly from God. I have to hear the word directly from God. And again, the thing about Hezekiah is he was close enough to God to feel like he could do that. And I don't. It doesn't bother me when someone comes up to someone and says, "Hey, will you pray for me?" Now, that's a good thing. But ultimately, we have a mediator between God and man, Jesus Christ, and we don't have to go into the confession and ask the priest to ask God to forgive us. We don't have to go in there and do that. We don't have to have a different intercessor. We now have our intercessor, who is Jesus Christ. And so we should be able to pray for ourselves. We should be able to pray for ourselves and hear from God ourselves. But the problem is, and Hezekiah did not have this kind of life, the problem is, and especially with the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, they didn't live a life that was that way. That's why they had to have Elijah. That's why they had to have Elisha. That's why they had to have these men of God who would come up and say, hey, this is what God said. But we live in a different age where we should be able to deal with God on our own personal basis. And as much as we should covet other men's prayers, we should be able to pray for ourselves. And Hezekiah was close enough to God and had tried to live a life that was close enough to God that he felt like, even though Isaiah said, thus says the Lord, and those words were true, that he said, look, I need to talk to God about this. I need to talk to God about this. And if God come, and I feel like that had God come back to Hezekiah and say, yes, Hezekiah, it's over, he would have set his house in order. I think if God would have come back to Hezekiah and said, you know what, Hezekiah, it's over, I think he would have worked on setting his house in order. But he wanted to hear it from God. He wanted to hear it directly from God. And even though Isaiah was the great prophet that he was, and even though Isaiah was as close to God as he was, and even though the words that Isaiah said were true, Hezekiah said, hey, wait a second. Me and God need to talk about this. We need to talk about this. So he says in verse number 2, it says that he turned his face to the wall and prayed. Again, like I said, he didn't set his house in order. He didn't call anyone. Isaiah walked out, and it almost appears to me that Isaiah's in there talking to him, and he's looking one way, and he just rolls over. He rolls over the other way, and he starts praying. And I was talking to the kids, and some people are this way. Brother Charlie was hilarious. You know, you'd be talking to Brother Charlie, and you'd be talking to him for a long time, and then all of a sudden, just right in the middle of the conversation, he'd be done. He'd just turn around and walk off. He just boom. He's just gone. And some people are just like that. You're just talking to them, and all of a sudden they're done with the conversation and they're just gone. And so I picture that here, where here's Isaiah, and he gives this word. No doubt he loved Hezekiah. He loved Hezekiah because of what Hezekiah did for Judah. And no doubt it broke his heart to have to deliver this message from God. But he brought that message from God to Hezekiah and said, hey, look, you know, God said, set your house in order, you're going to die. And so here Hezekiah looked at him, and he didn't argue with him. He didn't argue with the man of God. He just rolled over and turned his face to the wall. He just turned his face to the wall and prayed. And so here's Isaiah, and he just says, you know what, my part here is done. And he just leaves, Brother Croft. He just starts walking out. And no doubt it was tough because, I mean, you can imagine the news that he had to deliver and how it would have weighed on him to think, you know, I mean, who's going to be king next? He doesn't have a son right here. Who's going to be king next? Who's going to take over? You know, are they going to be like his dad? Are they going to be like his dad? Or are they going to be like Hezekiah? You know, who's going to come in next? And so he turns his face to the wall and he prays unto the Lord, saying, I beseech thee, O Lord. Beseech is a word we don't use very much anymore. But he was adamant in his prayer that, hey, look, God, you know, God, we need to talk. God, I need you to hear me. I need you to hear me. And I understand what Isaiah said, and I respect what Isaiah said, but me and you need to talk about this. And when was the last time you got that serious with God in your prayers? Again, you know, I mean, we don't, for most of us, we live in nice houses, and we got air conditioning in the summer, we got heat in the winter, and, you know, we got food, we got water, we got clothing, we got everything we need. We got transportation, we got everything we need, and so we get comfortable. You just get comfortable, and you don't pray as serious as you ought to pray until something like this comes in your life, and you're like, whoa, wait a second. Yeah, I may need to be a little bit more serious in my prayer. And so he says, I beseech you, O Lord, remember now how I've walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart. I want you also to see that God does not argue with him when he says that. God does not argue with him when he says, I've walked before you in truth and with a perfect heart. Again, you know, we're going to see eventually where the Bible tells us the part about Hezekiah that was not right. And it comes shortly after this chapter in his life. We're going to see that. But at this moment of his prayer, he said, God, I mean, I've walked before you. You know me. I'm not, you know, again, you don't ever want to pray, hey, I'm not like my dad. But God, I mean, you know, you put it in my heart to repair the temple. You put it in my heart to get rid of the altars. You put it in my heart to destroy the high places. You put it in my heart for us to observe the Passover the way the Passover was supposed to be observed. You put it in my heart to invite the Israel and the remnant of Israel to come back to Judah and worship God like they were supposed to worship God. God, for 14 years you prospered me. And again, depending on how you look at it, God, you just delivered us. You just delivered us from Sennacherib. You delivered us in such a mighty way that no one could look and say, God did not do that. And I didn't try and take credit for it. But you see, he said, God, I've walked before thee in truth. Again, when you walk before God in truth, what does that mean? That means that even though some people would say, God let someone get away with this, and God let someone get away with this, and Hezekiah's like, no, we're not going to do that. What does God say? What did he mean when he said it? And we're going to observe it the way God meant for it to be done. We're not going to make excuses. We're not going to say, it'll be fine. We're not going to say, well, because God let Solomon get away with it, maybe he'll let us do it too. No, he said, I've walked before you in truth. Whatever the word of God that he had, or the word from those prophets, if that's what it was, that's what it was. He said, I've walked before you in truth. I didn't try and twist your scriptures. I didn't try and twist the word. I didn't try to make excuses and make allowances for things that I wanted to do that I knew you didn't want done. I've walked before you in truth. And I thought about this, again, like I said, what if God gave Brother Randy the word, and to anyone in this room this morning, what if God gave Brother Randy the word this morning and said, hey, you need to have a conversation with, and put your name in that blank. And God said, set your house in order. Set your house in order, because you're going to die. Could you pray like Hezekiah prayed and said, God, I've walked before you in truth and with a perfect heart? Could you pray that prayer? And again, I know who we are. I know who I am. I couldn't pray that prayer. But the things that you know that are wrong, are they still wrong? Are you dealing with them? Are you dealing with them as God deals with you about them? And said, hey, look, God, I'm not right here, and I want to get this right. I want this to change, and I want this out of my life. Or are you making excuses? Are you making allowances? Are you, it's fine. We have to be careful. If we're, again, like I said, when you're cruising along through life, fat, dumb, and happy, and I've said it a bunch, God becomes your co-pilot whether you intend for him to be the co-pilot or not. He's your, and I hate to say it this way, but he's just a life insurance policy to a lot of people. He just becomes a life insurance policy. Well, if I die, I'm going to heaven. That's what a life insurance policy is, isn't it? Well, if something happens to me, my wife's taken care of. Something happens to me, my kids are taken care of. If something happens to me, then, I don't have to have that on my conscience as I'm sick and almost going to die. What's going to happen to my wife and kids? So, but, and a life insurance policy in Christianity, again, is like, well, I'm saved, but, and you just don't think about it. You don't think about it because you're like, I'll be fine. I'll go to heaven when I die. But you don't live a life that God's pleased with. You don't take it serious. And there are things that you know that you ought to be doing, and you're not doing those. There are things that you know that you should not be doing, and you're allowing yourself to do those. And what are you doing? You're making excuses. And so you can't walk before God with a perfect heart. You can't walk before him. You're like, well, And when I said it, what were the things that came to your mind? When I said, what are those things that came to your mind? Like, that's the thing that God wants to deal with you about. That's the thing that God wants you to deal with him about. And get it right. Again, we have the opportunity to get right. It isn't like you get saved and you have to live perfect from that day on. God understands who we are. God understands that we're flesh. And God understands that we're going to be tempted. And that we're going to stray. But he wants us to come back as soon as possible and get it right. And so, but here Hezekiah said, he said, remember how I've walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart and done that which is good in thy sight. He said, God, I mean, I'm looking back, I'm only 39, and I'm looking back, and really from the time that I can remember, I've tried to do what you wanted. And again, you got to think, it wasn't like Hezekiah had this great Christian heritage. Christian. It wasn't like Hezekiah had this great godly heritage. His father was Ahaz, a wicked king. A wicked king. And he rose above that. He rose above the idolatry. He rose above the wickedness that Ahaz brought in, where, if you remember, he worshipped under every green tree. He just, whatever it was, he worshipped, and wherever he worshipped. And here's Hezekiah, who was raised by that idolater, and he rejected that. And he's like, God, he said, you know that I've tried to always do right in your sight. And you got to think, I mean, whenever he made that proclamation when he became king, I mean, you got a whole nation that was full of idolaters. And it was not going to be just it wasn't always going to be an easy change. It turned out to be a good change. But he had to get them people on board. Even the priest lagged behind getting right with God. If you remember, even the priest lagged behind getting right with God because he's probably just doing this for a little while. But once they realized, hey, he's serious about this. Hey, he's serious. He's doing this work, and this stuff is, God, it's changing, and we're gonna have to get right or get out. And so he said, look, God, I've done that which was good in your sight. And then it says in verse number 3, and Hezekiah wept sore. Again, as men, I mean, that's really not something that's really in our repertoire, Miss Jimmy. I mean, it's something you try and keep out. Men aren't supposed to cry. Men aren't supposed to cry. Quit your crying. I mean, I get on to my boys. Quit your crying. Quit your crying. Quit your crying. And I'm like, what are you crying about? Well, that's not worth crying about. Quit your crying. But Hezekiah wept sore. I mean, he cried like a little baby. And if you remember from the time you were a child, I mean, do you remember from the time you were a child, whenever you wept, and you start doing the... I mean, that's how Hezekiah was weeping. I mean, he was weeping sore. It wasn't just, there's a little tear just running down his face. I mean, he had the whole thing going on, Brother Croft. I mean, it was an unconsolable cry. It was not something that you could just be like, get over it. No, that's not what was going on. And so in verse number 4 it says, and it came to pass before Isaiah was gone into the middle court, that the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, turn again. Again, like I said, if you're a man of God and you just said, hey, this is what God said, it looks like it's a matter of minutes to have to turn back around. It says a lot about who Isaiah is, to have the confidence to say, God said this, and then 15, 20 minutes later, Miss Jimmy, come back and say, hey, God said this. It says a lot about Isaiah that he was so confident in him hearing from God that he never doubted either time. He just went and told Hezekiah what God said, and now here he is again, and God says, hey, turn again and tell Hezekiah, the captain of my people, thus saith the Lord, the God of David thy father. Listen to what God says. I have heard thy prayer, and I have seen thy tears. You say, it's ridiculous. God put it in there for us to see. He put us in there for us to see that Hezekiah wept sore, and then he put it in there for us to see that God said, not only did I hear your prayer, but I also was watching you and how you reacted, and I saw how you were weeping. I saw your tears. I'd never seen that before, Brother Croft. I mean, I saw it, I've read it and read it and read it, but I never really paid attention that God pointed out the fact. God pointed it out that I saw your tears. I saw them. I will heal thee. On the third day thou shalt go up unto the house of the Lord, and I will add unto thy days 15 years. And so I'm going to stop right there. So again, he says, look, and again, like I said here, Isaiah is turning around and he's coming right back, and Hezekiah would have been a mess. I mean, if you've ever been around somebody that cried like that, they're a mess. They're an absolute mess. I mean, their face is all red and their eyes all red, and they're just an absolute mess. And in walks Isaiah, and I don't know if he was even over his fit yet. But he walks in, and maybe same thing. King, Isaiah needs to talk to you again. And he walks in, he's like, hey, I got another word from the Lord. And I want you to know that God heard your prayer. He saw your tears, and that he's going to heal you. And this is interesting to me. He's going to heal you, but it's going to be 3 days. It's going to be 3 days. Again, I mean, you know from reading when Jesus healed people, except for the blind man, I mean, basically it was just Jesus spoke the word. He spoke the word. And so, the blind man, he touched his eyes, and then he couldn't quite see, and then he touched him again. But I mean, other than that, I mean, Jesus just spoke the word and they were healed. It wasn't, hey, 3 days. But he said, I'm going to heal you, but you still have to suffer for just a little bit longer. You still have to suffer for just a little bit longer. And so he got the answer, and God tells him, he said, I will deliver thee and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. So again, like I said, if you want to think it happened before Sennacherib was gone, that's fine. If you want to think that after Sennacherib got back, because I mean, you think about it, if you're an army and you get defeated, you're trying to figure out what you did wrong, and you're going to go back up there and you're going to fix whatever you did wrong. You're going to fix that. And so maybe when Sennacherib went back, he's like, look, we're going to get us an army and we're going back up there. I don't know what happened to them 185,000. I don't know what happened to them guys. I don't know why they all died, but we're going back. Or it could have been his son, Esarhaddon, could have said, you know what? I don't know what my father did wrong, but we're going up there and we're going to fix this problem right here. We are Assyria. We're the baddest people on the planet. We're the biggest, baddest army in the world. And that little town in Jerusalem, that little country of Judah is not going to defeat us. And so, like I said, however you want to look at it. But God said, hey, look. He said, I'm not. He said, I'm going to protect this city. I'm going to deliver this city. I'm going to protect you from Assyria. You do not have to ever worry again. You don't ever have to worry again about the king of Assyria coming up here. Because God said, he said, I'm going to protect it for mine own sake. Look, I can't have them, after all they said about me, I cannot have them defeat this city. After everything that they said about me as a God, they cannot come up and defeat this city. I'm not going to let it happen. And so he said, and for, again, my servant David's sake. We spoke about that last week. I mean, how many times I need to look it up. I need to just look those 3 words up for my servant, or those couple words up for my servant David's sake. How many times did God do something for somebody, deserving or undeserving, for David's sake? How many times did God do that for someone for just David's sake? And he said, look, I'm going to do it for my sake, and I'm going to do it for David's sake, that I'm not going to let them destroy this city. And so, again, I mean, it's kind of an unorthodox method of what they do, but, I mean, I think a lot of the women in this church are somewhat natural healers, so it may not be as unorthodox to most of us as it is to people out in the world. But it says in verse 7, and Isaiah said, "Take a lump of figs." A what? No, that's not medicinal. Yeah, just take a lump of figs and lay it on it. No. We need to use this. We need to use that. And again, like I said, I mean, he used a form of medicine apparently, but it was just a lump of figs. And no doubt the doctors of the day were like, a lump of figs for a boil? He's like, yeah, just take a lump of figs. And Hezekiah wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to argue. He said, take a lump of figs, and he took it, laid it on the boil, and he recovered. Now, it kind of gets out of order right here, but in verse number 8, it says, Hezekiah said unto Isaiah, what shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me? And so he said, he asked for a sign. And you're like, you shouldn't ask for a sign. Well, okay. But Hezekiah asked for a sign, and guess what? God said, I'll give you a sign. I'll show you a sign. And Isaiah said to him, and again, you got to love Isaiah, because Isaiah was a man of God that knew God and was confident in God. And he said, you want a sign? What would you like to do? Would you like for the shadow to go forward 10 degrees or back 10 degrees? And so he's like, Hezekiah's like, well, I mean, it's naturally going forward on the dial. It's naturally going forward, so that's not necessarily going to be that special. So let me get you to turn it back. Let me get you to turn it back. And so in verse number 11, it says, Isaiah the prophet cried unto the Lord. And so you can imagine, I mean, here's Hezekiah, and apparently he was where he could see that dial. Apparently he was where he could look and see that dial. And here's Isaiah, he's praying and he's watching that dial. And I read one commentary where he said the dial was at noon, but again, I mean, the Bible doesn't say that, but anyway, for sake of reference, but here's that dial, and they said that dial was in half-hour increments. And so if it was at noon, it was going to roll back to 7 o'clock. And so here's Hezekiah, and he's looking at that dial, and wherever that dial was, wherever that shadow was on that dial, Isaiah's praying, and Hezekiah's got his eyes open. He's got his eyes open, and he's watching, and again, he's trusting God, and he watches that dial, and all of a sudden that dial was at wherever it was, that shadow was wherever it was on that dial, and then poof, 10 degrees. 10 degrees back. Just like that. Why? Because Isaiah had confidence that God could do it. And Hezekiah had confidence that God would do what he said he was going to do. And so that was not just something that only Hezekiah saw. It was one of those things that was heard around the world. Even the Babylonians heard, hey, something weird happened over there. Even they heard, well, why did the sun go back? Or why did the shadow go back 10 degrees? Because God healed Hezekiah. Oh, really? And so you see in this passage right here where, again, a lot of stuff that happened was unorthodox. Here's a man of God that gives a message, and within 20, 30 minutes, he's back delivering a different message. But both messages were true. Here's a man that lived his life for God, that got bad news, that God said, hey, you're going to die, set your house in order. And instead of saying, okay, I'm going to set my house in order, he turned his face to the wall and prayed and said, God, I don't know about all this. We need to talk about this. I'm too young to die. I got more life in me. I got more stuff I want to do. And God said, okay, I'll give you 15 more years. Everything about this story was unorthodox. I mean, Hezekiah's like, hey, I want a sign. Isaiah's like, okay, God will give you a sign. A lot of this stuff was unorthodox. But it was all ordained by God. God intended for every single bit of it to happen. Thank y'all.